This is the family whose house is as large as a hotel. These are the tickets that you asked for. My Uncle Kirk, who lives in Minnesota, loves cold winter mornings. Avocado toast, which I ate this morning, is a very healthy and filling breakfast. This is the time of day when I am most cranky. These statements all contain something called a relative clause. In this video, we will go in depth about relative clauses, which is also sometimes called an adjective clause. And its two basic types, the defining and the non-defining relative clause. It can be a difficult English concept to grasp, but I am confident by the end of this video you will have a much better understanding of how to use relative clauses in English. Because you're smart, right? Yeah, you're smart. I know you're smart. So if learning more about relative clauses is something that interests you, keep watching. So before we get into the defining and non-defining relative clause, let's back up a little bit and review what a clause is. So what is a clause? A clause is a group of words that contain both a subject and a verb. For example, this is a university where I spent 4 years of my life. This is the university, and where I spent 4 years of my life are both clauses because they both have a subject and a verb. A relative clause is a type of dependent clause, meaning that although it contains a subject and a verb, it is not a complete thought or sentence on its own. Check out my video on independent and dependent clauses if you need a review of these concepts. Relative clauses are useful and very common in English. Using them can make our sentences more interesting and in turn make us better writers and speakers of English. So, a few points about relative clauses before we dive into learning more about defining and non-defining clauses specifically. And we are going to use the sentence, "This is the university where I spent 4 years of my life," as a reference. So the relative clause is a dependent clause, as I've mentioned, and it is a clause that works like an adjective in a sentence, which is why it is also called an adjective clause. So it functions as an adjective would. The relative clause gives additional or modifying information to a noun or pronoun in another clause in the sentence. And in some situations, it can even modify the other clause as a whole. Of course, all of this will be explained later. The relative clause is placed directly after the noun or pronoun it describes. That is what's proper, at least. If you do not place it directly after the noun or pronoun it describes, your statement will become confusing. Okay? And the very last important point, the relative clause begins with a relative pronoun. All right, and these are our relative pronouns. Who for people, but we also sometimes use it for animals, especially when that animal is a pet. You know, people like to humanize their pets, so sometimes we do use it for animals. My Uncle Kirk, who lives in Minnesota, loves cold winter mornings. That for people, animals, and things. Although some super conservative grammarians will tell you not to use that for people, but to be frank, English speakers use that for people all the time. You hear it often, and it is what it is. But to be on the safe side, especially in written English, or if you are taking some sort of exam, it's best to use that for just things and animals and who for people. So our example would be, these are the tickets that you asked for. We use which for animals and things. Avocado toast, which I ate this morning, is a very healthy and filling breakfast. We use whom for people, but only when the person is the object, okay? And here I'd also like to add that whom is formal and not used much these days, but you will still see it. More commonly, people will just use who for both subjects and objects. So if whom is confusing to you and when to use whom, just use who for people. And our example, he is the person whom we met at the concert. So we met him, so he is the object. And we use whose for possession. So although it looks like who, it is not talking about a who. It is talking about something that someone or some people possess or own. So this is the family whose house is as large as a hotel. They own, the family owns the house. They possess that house. When for times. This is the time of day when I am most cranky. Where for places. This is the university where I spent 4 years of my life. And I'd also like to point out that when and where are technically called relative adverbs, but in many textbooks they are grouped as relative pronouns because doing such, grouping them as relative pronouns, sort of makes this concept easier to teach and easier to learn. Okay, so let's tackle the defining relative clause. The defining relative clause is also sometimes called the restrictive relative clause and the essential relative clause, but they all mean the same thing. And in this video, I'm just going to keep calling it the defining relative clause, okay? And the defining relative clause gives us extremely important, essential information about a noun or pronoun in the sentence. In other words, it modifies, it defines who or what or when or where, etc. we are actually talking about. And like I mentioned, this defining information is extremely important. Without it, we might have a difficult time knowing exactly who or what we are talking about or describing. So let's take another look at some of the examples we looked at earlier. This sentence, this is the university where I spent 4 years of my life, contains a defining relative clause. The defining relative clause, where I spent 4 years of my life, is essential to the sentence. We would not know which university I was talking about if I don't give this information. If I simply said, this is the university, you would ask, which university? There are millions of, well, maybe not millions, but there are thousands, let's say thousands of universities in the world. So we added this essential information to define which university I actually meant, and that is the university where I spent 4 years of my life. Now we know what I am talking about. Okay, and now we're looking at, these are the tickets that you asked for. Again, this contains a defining relative clause that you asked for, right? We added essential, very important information to the clause. These are tickets. Without the information that you asked for without the relative clause, you would be asking, what tickets are you talking about? Tickets for what? I'm confused. So this is why we added that relative clause that you asked for. Oh, okay, those tickets. You specified. You defined what tickets you were talking about. We could also say these are the tickets which you asked for. It's a bit less common, actually, in defining relative clauses than that, and it sounds a bit more formal, but it is okay to use. But some grammarians prefer you avoid using which in defining relative clauses, and they would like for us to use that, especially in the United States. So use your own discretion. Our next sentence, I know the man who climbed Mount Everest last year. Again, this sentence contains another defining relative clause. This time we use the word who as our relative pronoun because we are talking about the man. And we again are giving very important information. We are specifying which man we are talking about. The man who climbed Mount Everest. So it helps identify who we are talking about because, let's face it, not too many men have climbed Mount Everest last year. So we are narrowing it down with that defining relative clause. Next, this is the family whose house is as large as a hotel. This is a defining relative clause. This time it is showing possession with the relative pronoun whose. We are defining which family we are talking about. Which family? Oh, the family whose house is as large as a hotel. Okay, so now we know which family we are talking about, who the family who owns, who possesses this hotel-looking house. And oh my, that is a nice looking house. So remember, whom is formal and not as commonly used as who in most cases. In most cases, you can just use who instead of whom, but we can and you will often see people using whom, especially in writing, right, to talk about people when the person is the object. So in our sentence here, we have, he is the person whom we met at the concert. And this is defining because it gives essential information about the person. We would not be able to identify who the person was if we weren't told that he was the person whom we met at the concert. And then we have, this is the time of day when I am most cranky. We use the relative pronoun when. Again, here we are adding very important essential information about the time of day. We are defining the time of day when I'm most cranky. In some cases, it is okay and common to actually omit or leave out the relative pronoun in a defining relative clause. We can omit the relative pronouns, but we can only do this when the relative pronoun is not representing the subject of the clause. Okay, so for instance, he is the man whom I love can be reduced to he is the man I love because whom is not representing the subject, it's representing the object in that sentence. And I lost the book which you gave me can be reduced to I lost the book you gave me because which is not representing the subject of that clause. It is representing the object. What book did I lose? I lost the book which you gave me, the one you gave me. And it's the same thing with I lost the book that you gave me, right? That is representing the object of the clause, the book that you gave me. That can also be reduced to I lost the book you gave me. So we made it to the end of our section on defining relative clauses. You're awesome. I knew you could do it. So here is a little recap. The defining relative clause can also be called the essential or restrictive relative clause. It gives us essential or defining information about a noun or a pronoun in another clause in the sentence. Defining relative clauses always begin with a relative pronoun: who, which, that, where, when, whom, or whose. The pronoun can be omitted if it doesn't represent the subject of the clause. Okay, and now we are going to move on to non-defining relative clauses, also called a non-restrictive relative clause or a non-essential relative clause. A non-defining clause also provides additional information about a noun or pronoun in another clause in the sentence, but it is not essential information. It is not information that is very important. It's helpful, but not essential. We can understand the sentence without it. Also, very important, a non-defining relative clause is set off, it is set apart by a comma or commas. The whole clause is put in commas if it comes in the middle of a sentence, okay? So knowing this will help you easily identify non-defining relative clauses. In non-defining relative clauses, we can use the relative pronouns which, who, when, where, whom, and whose, but not that. That cannot be used with non-defining relative clauses. So let's take a look at some of the examples used in the very beginning of this video. My Uncle Kirk, who lives in Minnesota, loves cold winter mornings. So you can see where the non-defining relative clause is immediately because it's set off by commas. And it is additional information about my Uncle Kirk, but it's not essential to understand the sentence or to understand who we are talking about. I already said he was my Uncle Kirk. I'm just adding an extra bit of information about my Uncle Kirk that may be helpful. And you can see that I placed this non-defining relative clause right after the noun it describes. You have to make sure you do that, otherwise your sentence will be confusing and incorrect. We wouldn't know who the non-defining clause is describing if you don't put it directly after my Uncle Kirk. Another example of a non-defining clause from the very beginning of this video is avocado toast, which I ate this morning, is a very healthy and filling breakfast. So the information which I ate this morning gives additional information on avocado toast. Avocado toast is something I ate. This isn't essential or identifying information. I already know what avocado toast is, but it gives us more non-essential but maybe helpful information about avocado toast. And again, when it comes to things and non-defining relative clauses, we must use which, never that. Okay, and it would be a good time to point out that which, the relative pronoun which, is special because it not only is able to provide additional information about a noun or a pronoun in another clause, but it can modify the other clause itself, the whole clause. Let me give you an example of that. I graduated university with a 3.9 GPA, which I was very proud of. The relative clause, which I was very proud of, modifies the whole clause before it. It is not just the noun before it. What was I proud of? The fact that I graduated university with a 3.9 GPA. The whole idea in that clause is what I was proud of. Okay, so back to more examples of non-defining relative clauses. Washington, D.C., where the Supreme Court is located, is the capital of the United States. The non-defining relative clause, you can see because it's set off by commas, is where the Supreme Court is located. It gives non-essential information about Washington, D.C. It does not help us define or identify the city, as we clearly already say it is Washington, D.C. We just give supporting additional information about Washington, D.C. And next we have, in 2007, when I was in high school, the first Apple iPhone was introduced to the world. Our non-defining relative clause is when I was in high school. It does not help us identify any year. The year is already known, 2007. It just gives more information about that year. It was the year when I was in high school. Next, we have the Birch family, whose house is as large as a hotel, own many properties in this area. So the non-defining clause here, whose house is as large as a hotel, is additional but non-essential information about the Birch family, who we don't need to define because we already did. It's the Birch family. Then we have my friend Polly, whom I've known for a very long time, is a gourmet chef. So again, we are using whom because Polly is the object. I've known Polly, right? And the relative clause is non-defining because it just gives additional non-essential info about who Polly is, but it's not defining. I've already defined her. She is my friend Polly. And just like in defining relative clauses, you can use who instead of whom here. And that's probably more common anyways. And if you are a little confused about when to use whom for people, then just stick with who, because that's always going to be correct. So we are done, English learners, learning about defining and non-defining relative clauses. We've almost made it to the end of the video. Before I let you go, let's have a little review on everything we learned so far. The defining relative clause gives us essential, identifying information about a noun or pronoun in another clause, all right? And with defining relative clauses, there is no need to use commas. Also, we can omit the relative pronoun from these types of clauses when the pronoun is not the subject of the clause. So you can omit the relative pronoun in some instances for defining relative clauses. Non-defining relative clauses add extra, not essential, but maybe helpful information to a clause or about a noun or pronoun in another clause, okay? We cannot use relative pronouns that with these types of clauses. Use which always when talking about things. And also with non-defining relative clauses, we cannot omit the relative pronoun, okay? So with defining, we can omit the relative pronoun when it is not the subject, but with non-defining, you always have to leave that relative pronoun in. Okay, and very important, this last point, we offset the relative clause with commas. So if that relative clause comes in the middle of a sentence, then we set it off with 2 commas, one at the beginning and one at the end of the clause. And if it comes at the end, then you just have to put it in at the beginning of that relative clause. Okay, and that is the end of our video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I know you are more comfortable now using relative clauses. Practice these concepts, make sentence using relative clauses, defining and non-defining. Feel free to leave a comment. If you have any questions, give this video a like, subscribe for more English videos, and until next time, English learners.